This is Chapter 6, Section 1, U.S. History 2, U.S. Expansion in the Pacific. In the 1600s, the Japanese were not a fan of the European nations coming over to Asia and establishing their culture in Asia. And Japanese didn't really want European culture contaminating traditional Japanese culture. So in 1633, Japan closed its borders from um, all outsiders and foreigners, and they also kept their people in. So they were complete isolation. Um, so it's Sekako, it's a closed country, and then no one entered Japan borders during this entire span of time. No one left either. Until merchants started really wanting to trade with Japan for the unique Japanese goods. They're like, what is this country? They're closed off. They must have some really good stuff. So no one was successful during these 200 years in trading with Japan. But in 1853, the U.S. did attempt to open Japan's borders for trade. Commodore Matthew Perry commanded a squadron of warships to sail into Tokyo Bay to convince the Japanese to open its borders to trade. So Japan's all the way over here. Here's the United States. So we have to sail all the way over with these warships to try to convince Japanese to open up their borders for some trade. It's a long trip. So when they got there, the Japanese were very surprised and very frightened. The Japanese, no one living had ever seen an American, but when Japan closed their borders, the United States didn't even exist. Okay, um, but no one alive in Japan had even remembered was alive to see Europeans. So that was pretty shocking. They thought Americans looked pretty barbaric and ugly. Um, Generally, that European Americans they're taller, just look different than Japanese people. They thought they were ugly, barbaric looking people. They'd never seen guns before, the black powder, or warships. That this is what they thought it looked like. Just this big thing smoking. These warships with cannons. They never saw these things before. So Japan realized how far behind technologically they had become since closing their borders. Pretty much in 200 years, their society didn't change because they didn't have any influence from anybody else, and they kept up just very traditional for over 200 years. Um, and the Japanese didn't have guns until 1850s. So Japan agrees to trade with the United States to become more industrial. And so then Japan does catch up very quickly. They start trading, they start industrializing, they start mobilizing. Okay, Alaska. Alaska was originally established as a Russian colony in 1867. Russia believed that Alaska was a frozen wasteland and that they didn't really need it. They kind of just wanted it because it was the next land step, from Siberia into North America. But they wanted to sell Alaska. Russia already had so much land; it's still the biggest country in the world. Um, so they wanted to sell Alaska to the United States, but they didn't want to sell it to England because England already had Canada, which is a huge land mass. Um, so they didn't want their main rival England to have more land. So they wanted to sell it to the United States. So here's Russia. Russia kind of continues on. That's all Siberia, and there's Alaska. There's Canada. This whole thing is Canada, in which um, the England owns. All right, so they wanted to sell it to the United States, but you can just see the size of Alaska. It's a massive state. So in 1867, the Secretary of State William Seward purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, only 2 cents an acre. And that's Alaska's twice the size of Texas. It's massive. It's a bargain. Originally, Alaska was seen as a bad purchase by Americans because everyone thought Alaska was a frozen wasteland. The purchase became known as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. It was known as Seward's Folly because the folly is a mistake. You shouldn't buy it. You were tricked into it. Like, this is supposed to represent a Russian guy, and he's showing them the land, and the Seward's like, oh yeah, looks good, blah blah blah. And it's like, he's being tricked into it. I believe that's even a Yeti. But in the 1880s, large amounts of gold were found in Alaska. I was like, wait a second, Alaska's pretty good. And then even better, eventually, great deposits of oil were found in Alaska. It's like, wow, this thing's way more valuable than we thought. And then finally, a pipeline was constructed to move oil from Alaska to the rest of America. So it's literally a pipeline distributing oil to the rest of the United States. And now Alaska is very valuable for all of its natural resources, and it's beautiful up there. From all the pictures. One thing about Alaska is that in the summertime it's almost 24 hours of light, and then in the wintertime it's almost 24 hours of darkness. But you'll have that. George Washington. So spreading these American values. All these other European countries, they were spreading their influences in other regions of the world. But way back when George Washington was president, he warned the United States to not make these permanent alliances with other countries. And until the late 1800s, the United States had a policy of isolationism, avoiding involvement in any other nation's affairs. We're going to mind our own business, do our own thing. But European nations practice this imperialism. That's building empires by imposing their political and economic control over people in weaker country. A good one is like England took over India and just many other countries. Egypt. They would just come in, take over, usually take over by military force. And by the late 1800s, the United States said, all right, we're going to attempt to expand like the Europeans. We're going to attempt it. Wasn't until then that the United States really tried. And then by the late 1800s, all the United States lands was explored. So this is kind of the reason why we wanted to expand. There was no more frontier. So overseas expansion was the new frontier. Let's go see what's going on in other parts of the world and explore. And then we went and wanted to expand because of American economic growth. The Industrial Revolution had the U.S. producing more goods than Americans could purchase. We just were making too much, and the United States didn't have that much demand, so the United States needed new markets to sell our goods and trade to. Naval Captain Alfred T. Mahan believed that a strong navy would promote economic trade and also protect the U.S. sea lanes. And also, we had to protect the U.S. sea lanes to protect our economy. So President Theodore Roosevelt agreed that building a strong navy would show the rest of the world that the United States is here, we're a world power, and here's our strength. So Roosevelt had the Great White Fleet constructed. It was 16 new warships, and they would sail around the world, stopping at different locations, displaying the power of the United States. The world would recognize after this tour that the United States is a world power. So this is what they look like. The pictures back then weren't great, but these are state-of-the-art warships. They were white and gold, very fancy, very intimidating. And then this is their trip. They went literally all around the world, Australia, into Africa, Asia, and Africa, all around South America, just showing everyone like, hey, we're something. Hawaii is an island in the middle of So moving on to Hawaii, it's an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the Hawaiian people lived undisturbed from outside influence until 1778, when British explorer Captain James Cook arrived. The United States wanted Hawaii because of the strategic location. Even though Hawaii is beautiful and everything, it's just a nice. United States was on the other side of Asia, and they needed a place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean to stop. So it's the perfect location for a Navy base. Like I said, like the United States is here, where's Hawaii? So it's a good middle ground, stopping point in the Pacific Ocean. So Hawaii was discovered to be great for growing sugarcane and exotic fruits such as pineapples. Queen Liliuokalani was a Hawaiian queen that rejected these, any kind of U.S. involvement into the territory. She was a monarch. She was a queen. She didn't want outside influence. She resisted any kind of treaty with the United States, but the United States really wanted Hawaii. Finally, in 1897, using military force, kind of forcing Hawaii into becoming a territory of the United States. And really, as a territory, is that just land controlled by the U.S., but it's not an independent state yet. And then we have China. In the late 1800s, European nations began dividing China into their own separate territories known as spheres of influence. The U.S. did not want to miss the opportunity to gain influence in China and demand an open door policy. And the open door policy is all nations have an equal opportunity to trade with China. So this is a great picture. This guy is supposed to represent China. This is England, Russia, Germany, France, even Japan. All right, so they all want a piece of the pie, and they all have their knives out, and they want to see what they can get. And this is, China. They're gonna carve it up. Who gets what piece? So the Chinese people did not like all the European nations. They did not want to be divided up. So this group, the Righteous Fist of Harmony, was a secret society that organized to fight against the foreigners. The European called them boxers because they would have these closed fists, and then when they would be performing these ceremonial exercises, it looks like they were boxing. So the Boxer Rebellion eventually happened. These Righteous Fists of Harmony finally attempted to remove the European influence by rebelling against the foreigners. They burned Christian churches, they burned homes of foreigners. Eventually, 18,000 soldiers, led by the United States, ended the rebellion. The rebellion was able to end because these soldiers had modern weaponry, and the Righteous Fists of Harmony did not. Over 2,000 Chinese and foreigners died during the rebellion. Like you can see here, this is a Righteous Fist of Harmony member. This is one of these rich foreigners. They were just killing them. And then once the soldiers came, they started killing all these Righteous Fist of Harmony members. So after the Boxer Rebellion, what a disaster! It was decided that China was not to be broken up and remain one country, and it was not to be split up. This concludes Chapter 6, Section 1.